During Lent, we've taken 5 weeks to look back at 1 week, the last week of Jesus' human life. This has allowed us to expand time, to freeze frame important moments, and dig deeper into our faith story and our own story. This morning marks the end of Lent and the beginning of the commemoration of Holy Week. And so let us look back a bit as we remember the entrance of Jesus into Jerusalem. We found our place in the parade and considered our place in the picture, our role as supporters of Jesus' mission in the world. And then we found ourselves in the midst of the chaos and throngs of people in Jerusalem for the Passover. We stopped there, suspending the action for a moment, wondering how we could join Jesus in clearing out our own lives and hearts, our own places of worship, to make them a more welcoming place for the love of God to reside fully. We followed Jesus as he continued to teach in the city and among the people at the temple. His teachings filled our hearts as they filled those long ago, and we remembered the call to proclaim justice in the midst of injustice wherever we find it. We joined the disciples at a table of extravagant affection and overflowing love, and then another supper, where all our assumptions about the way the world works were turned upside down. This week, we join Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. Gethsemane is the moment when a chain of events begins that cannot be halted. Once Jesus is taken into custody, there is no going back. So we pause a moment with him in the garden, just before his arrest, and we feel with him the temptations that arise when facing difficult circumstances. To run, hide, use whatever power we have to change things, fight it, perhaps even bargain with God. We walk away among the sleepy disciples who just can't grasp what is about to happen.
Let us pray. Here we are, Jesus. We find ourselves alongside you in a garden of grief for the violence so many of this world endure. We are tired. We don't know what to do next. And so we sleep sometimes, hoping to awake from a bad dream. Forgive us, O God. Help us face this hour knowing you are always here. You only ask the same of us, to be present, to be awake, You entered our story through Jesus. Now help us to enter fully into the story of your kingdom on earth as it is in heaven. Amen.
Know this, we can open to let the story remind us that no matter what we face or how we fail to meet the demand of the moment, second chances are possible. You are forgiven and freed, encouraged and loved by a God who wants us to live fully. Let us enter the passion of Christ.
Jesus' defense in those moments in the garden was prayer. Not the sword that one of his disciples wanted to use to protect him, but prayer was his source of power, that God's will would sustain him the next day. Jesus knows what is about to go down, and he will not use violence in these last hours. The letter to the Ephesians offers us the alternative armor with which we can gird ourselves to work for what is right. I will now be reading Ephesians 6:11-17. Put on God's armor so that you can make a stand against the tricks of the devil. We aren't fighting against human enemies, but against rulers, authorities, forces of cosmic darkness, and spiritual powers of evil in the heavens. Therefore, pick up the full armor of God so that you can stand your ground on the evil day, and after you have done everything possible to still stand. So stand with the belt of truth around your waist, justice as your breastplate, and put shoes on your feet so that you are ready to spread the good news of peace. Above all, carry the shield of faith so that you can extinguish the flaming arrows of the evil one. Take the helmet of salvation and the sword of the Spirit, which is God's word. Too much wine, perhaps, or maybe I'm so sleepy because I'm just so very tired. This week is taking its toll on me. Watching our every step, wondering when the other shoe will drop, afraid that the commotion stirred up about Jesus will result in something terrible. I've been on edge ever since we got here. But oh my, that parade. Who would have thought that this man I met on the shores of my fishing spot would turn out to be 3 years of non-stop surprises? The entrance into Jerusalem was more amazing than all of it combined. I felt sure that I was part of something that was going to change everything. Now I'm not so sure. Not everyone, it turned out, was so pleased about Jesus' arrival here, and we've been under scrutiny for days. Then, tonight at the table, Jesus revealed that one of us was about to hand him over. I'm noticing he was missing here in the garden, and I'm wondering if maybe he was right. My gut turns over with the thought of it. I did not want to face that these people who have become my family could turn against one another under pressure. Fear threatens our very bonds. So why put ourselves out here in the open? We need to stay awake, keep watch. I've got my sword. I know Jesus told me not to bring it, but come on. All he seems to think we need to do is pray. He asked us to pray with him. Yes, I pray. I'm praying. I'll fervently pray. But is it enough? How can God help us if soldiers arrive? And yet, I'm so sleepy.
And now from the Gospel of Mark, chapter 14, continuing, verses 37-52. Then he returned to his disciples and found them sleeping. "Simon," he said to Peter, "are you asleep? Couldn't you keep watch for 1 hour? Watch and pray so that you will not fall into temptation. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak." Once more he went away and prayed the same thing. When he came back, he again found them sleeping because their eyes were heavy. They did not know what to say to him. Returning the third time, he said to them, "Are you still sleeping and resting? Enough. The hour has come. Look, the Son of Man is delivered into the hands of sinners. Rise, let us go. Here comes my betrayer." Just as he was speaking, Judas, one of the 12, appeared. With him was a crowd armed with swords and clubs, sent from the chief priests, the teachers of the law, and the elders. Now the betrayer had arranged a signal with them. "The one I kiss is the man. Arrest him and lead him away under guard." Going at once to Jesus, Judas said, "Rabbi," and kissed him. The men seized Jesus and arrested him. Then one of those standing near drew his sword and struck the servant of the high priest, cutting off his ear. "Am I leading a rebellion," said Jesus, "that you have come out with swords and clubs to capture me? Every day I was with you, teaching in the temple courts, and you did not arrest me. But the scriptures must be fulfilled." Then everyone deserted him and fled. A young man, wearing nothing but a linen garment, was following Jesus. When they seized him, he fled naked, leaving his garment behind.
Enter the passion. Enter the place we belong, not just looking on. For this is our passion. Enter the passion. Enter the passion. Enter the place we belong, not just looking on. For this is our passion. Enter the passion. Enter the story. Enter the passion. Enter his passion.
This springtime is one of my favorite times of the year. As you see the flowers bursting from the ground, the buds on the trees, you think of the beautiful colors of flowers as they emerge. I saw daffodils blooming just outside the church here today. I'm wondering if you could place yourself into a flower garden, someplace you've been. Maybe it's even your own garden, but I can think of several that really stand out to me. Monet's home, the painter in Giverny, France. Some beautiful, beautiful scenery. And you can tell by the painter was inspired to paint the water lily series that he did. Some botanical conservatories, gardens that I've been to. Just so many beautiful types and colors of flowers that you don't see every place else. The beauty of a garden, especially a flower garden, just brings all these colors. Even every Sunday as we gather together here in this place, we see pictures such as the mural that's before us. I wonder how often, though, we take for granted the flowers that are at the bottom, or even the stained glass windows that we see on a regular basis. There's a flower at the top of each one. Those flowers, whether it's the aroma that I talked about last week, or just the beauty of them as we see them, really can calm us. And that contrast today is with our story. Here Jesus and 3 of his disciples go to the Garden of Gethsemane. We don't know exactly what that garden might have looked like at the time, but it is a contrast that Jesus needs after these moments that have just happened and what is about to come. So he tells the 3 disciples to stay and pray and stay awake. He goes off just a little bit of a distance and he prays himself. In fact, these are personal prayers. We oftentimes think about our prayer life as prayers that we send to other folks, those that we know that are going through something difficult. Maybe someone who's going through cancer, someone who has gone through a car accident, someone who is near death and praying for their families, others who have been going through natural disasters. Whatever it may be, we often pray for other folks. We do that every Sunday here as we have a time of prayer. But Jesus in this moment is praying for himself, This is not unheard of. In fact, we are asked and encouraged to pray. We even have some good examples of praying for ourselves. Look at the very first verse of Psalm 22. My God, why have you forsaken me? And then we go on to Psalm 23, the very first verse. The Lord is my shepherd. Both depict something that we are dealing with. Jesus needs a time of prayer, needs a time of centering. All of us need that. That's why the encouragement of prayer that comes into our lives through God's inspiration to us. In whatever moment, wherever we find ourselves, whether we're at home, which most of you are right now, or some other place, I oftentimes find myself drawn to a prayer time while I'm driving, while I'm sitting at a stoplight. Just a quick prayer. Because in that moment, I've been touched by God to say, I need to reach out to this one, this person, that one who's dealing with this. And all of a sudden, I'm just filled with God's Spirit to say, I have to reach out to them. And even though they may not be with me in the moment, I can pray. And so Jesus prays. And as he's done praying, he comes back to the disciples, these three that have joined him, Peter, James, and John, and they've fallen asleep. Now, it's been a long day. There's been a lot going on. I know how that is. When someone goes through a long day, you get tired. You're ready to go to bed. I'm sure these three disciples were in that same situation that night. I also know folks who can fall asleep very easily. My dad, for one. He has been really good at taking naps, especially here later in life. But even growing up years, I remember that trying to watch a movie with my dad was not something that he would usually stay awake through the whole thing. We would give him a hard time and often laugh about, do you know what happened in the end? Or did you catch this moment in the movie? But that wasn't the case for these disciples. You see, they have been observant of Jesus' ministry all these years. And in fact, these three disciples especially have been with him all the way since they were called in Galilee. These three know what Jesus is capable of doing. And yet, in the moment, in their humanness, they fall asleep. So Jesus chastises them and encourages them, asks them to stay awake. And he goes off and he prays a second time. The second time he comes back, and again, the disciples have fallen asleep. And so finally, a third time, he goes off into the same place and prays again for himself. And the third time, he returns, and again, yes, the disciples have fallen asleep. It reminds me of a song that I learned in the Taizé community in France, one that I've sung often here in worship services, Taizé services at the seminary and other places. It inspires us to stay awake through this process, whatever we're going through. Stay with me, remain here with me, watch and pray, watch and pray. Stay with me, remain here with me, watch, pray. All of these things are what's happening with Jesus and the encouragement of these three disciples. But how often do we lose track? Do we lose sight? Do we fall away? Do we fall asleep? Maybe there's something that we've been called to do and we just can't do it. I read a story of someone who was called to the bedside of someone in hospice care, and yet they owned up to the fact that they were terrified of going. They just couldn't take themselves into a hospice because they hadn't experienced it before. What is it that we get from this message? We are encouraged to continue to pray. We are encouraged to continue to be watchful, mindful of what's happening around us. And we are encouraged to continue to follow the path that Jesus has led before us. You see, these disciples, just like us, we know what Jesus is capable of doing. In fact, in verse 31 of Mark 14, just before this passage, Peter has said that he's not going to deny Jesus. We know that that happens 3 times as well. And the very last line of verse 31 says, and all the other disciples did as well. They said the same thing. We don't have all 11 of them, 11 at this time, saying, I'm not going to deny you. I'm not going to forget you. But by the end of this passage in chapter 14, they have all left. A prophecy. Jesus knew from Zechariah's message that this would happen. He told the disciples, but they, of course, didn't believe him. I'm going to stand by you no matter what, Lord. I'm sure each of the disciples were feeling and knowing in their hearts. And yet, when it comes to a moment like this, soldiers come, swords are drawn. We get worried, concerned. We don't know what to do. One of them slices off the ear of one of the guards, and Jesus stops the violence. Even though he has just prayed for himself, his prayer finishes with, whatever is in your will, Father. Whatever is in your will. Oh, so often we want those prayers to be answered the way we want them to be. And it is hard to say, whatever you want, God, whatever you think is best, God, I'm going to be okay with. You see, even though Jesus prayed for himself, he knew what needed to happen. It's hard when we go through something difficult and we know what might happen to just kind of walk along with that. But we are committed to praying through that experience, to know for sure that that is where God is leading us. How are you praying these days? It's okay to pray for yourself. It's okay to pray in the moment. Maybe stopping in your kitchen in the middle of something else and saying, Lord, I just need to speak to you about this. So many difficult things are happening in our life today. But we need to be drawn to prayer even more because of those situations. There are always times in our life where we may come to a point where we just don't know what to do. So we're drawn to prayer. Just like Jesus. Jesus, who gave us an example of how to pray back in Matthew 6, the Sermon on the Mount. And now in this moment, knowing that he is going to be put to death, comes to the garden and prays. The last part of this passage, even though all 4 Gospels has this account in the Garden of Gethsemane, this last part brings a little bit of a smile and maybe even some awkwardness. The last verse of this passage, only found in Mark, is this young man who is only clothed in a linen cloth. He's grabbed by someone, the guards, we assume, and as he runs away, the cloth falls and he is naked. We don't like to talk much about nudity, especially in the church, although we know that's how humankind began with Adam and Eve. But in that rawness, that openness, maybe there's something about us that we see in this young man. We come to try to do something, and yet we don't know what to do, and so we run away. I am drawn to a quote from the book that we've been reading in this Lenten series. I'm going to read just this last portion. It is a quote from the very last page of the last chapter of the book. Like Mark's reader, perhaps this man is like Mark's reader, fearful, about to face the death of Jesus, and unable to do anything about it. We too are vulnerable and fearful. We too have deserted. We too have failed to stop what cannot be stopped. Lent will strip us down, and in the rawness, that openness, we can begin to heal. Before we get to the resurrection, there will be suffering and crucifixion and death. My friends, we have made it through suffering before. We will again. Continue to pray. Not only for those around you, your families, your neighbors, your friends, but pray for yourself. It's okay. Jesus sets us a great example. And yet, also, we know that there will be glory that comes from difficult things. In these moments of this Lenten week with Jesus and the disciples, there is hurt, there is pain, there is uncertainty. But hallelujah, once we come to Sunday. After that Good Friday experience of Jesus on the cross, we come to Sunday with a new hope and new possibilities. May we find that same strength during this time of uncertainty that we live in today. Through prayer, through Jesus, through the cross and the resurrection. Amen. This season we have put a frame around a bit of life. We've sectioned off a scene. We've looked long into a face to see what we can see, to know what we can know. Just as we have done with the art and story today, zoom in your focus on the art and story of life, especially in this Holy Week. The divine artist offers us such poignant beauty each day in our own stories and in the stories around us, especially in the heartbreak and pain and joy and awe in a simple moment turned significant. That's what happens when we put a frame around it. We zoom in for an existential close-up and search for clues for living this life with more attention and intention. May you be blessed by the sacred frames that surround the moments of your life that you dare not miss.